Nolite confidere in principibus in filius hominum in quibus non as salus. A little Latin in honor of St. Martin's. It's always good to start with a little Latin, right? The passage comes from Psalm 145 or 146, depending on which translation you use. It's given in the Douay as, "Put not your trust in princes and the children of men in whom there is no salvation." Put not your trust in princes and the children of men in whom there is no salvation. Now the fact is that when the psalmist wrote these lines 3,000 years ago, a man might be excused for looking to his ruler. I'm just going to put a semicolon here, rock and roll. When the psalmist penned these lines 3,000 years ago, a man might be excused for looking to his ruler to see that his lot in life was not too severe, that justice prevailed in the kingdom, and even perhaps that some form of higher civilization might be cultivated by royal example or even decree. Throughout antiquity, there were the Herods and the Neros and the Caligulas who exploited their offices for material gain or sybaritic pleasure or both. But for all of these, there were the Octavians, the Trajans, the Vespasians, the Aurelians, whose actions were, in the main, motivated by a desire to serve the common good, to secure the borders, and often promote learning and beauty. Octavian's sister, right? Octavia sent Virgil 10,000 pieces of silver in gratitude for his Aeneid. And even the Medicis, right? Italy's first crime family, had the good sense to support, among others, Masaccio, Brunelleschi, Fra Angelico, Donatello, and Michelangelo. And indeed, as Christian Europe took shape, monarchs on the order of Charlemagne, Ferdinand and Isabella, Philip II of Spain, aimed with all sincerity to unite their governments with the government of God. And some achieved sanctity along the way. Alfred the Great, who translated Boethius into English. Edward the Confessor, who built the first Westminster Abbey. Louis IX, Saint Louis, the heroic Crusader king, who also labored to create a just economy for the people of France. Alas, our own age does not produce the likes of a Charlemagne or a Saint Louis. It has not for some time. And yet at the very moment in history when we should be most heeding King David's words not to put our trust in princes, Americans seem to invest no end of hope in today's version of a prince, the politician. And conservative Catholics, whatever that word means, conservative, I think I know what the word Catholic means, they are not free from this error. G.K. Chesterton recognized this trap a century ago. He wrote, "At present we all tend to make one mistake. We tend to make politics too important. We tend to forget how huge a part of a man's life is the same under a sultan or a senate, under Nero or Saint Louis. Daybreak is a never-ending glory. Getting out of bed is a never-ending nuisance. Food and friends will be welcome. Work and strangers must be accepted and endured. Birds will go bedward and children will not until the end of the last evening." Or as Samuel Johnson rendered the same idea 150 years earlier, "How small of all that human hearts endure, that part which laws or kings can cause or cure." How small of all that human hearts endure, that part which laws or kings can cause or cure. Well said, but David really gets to the heart of the matter. "Put not your trust in princes and the children of men in whom there is no salvation. In other words, my friends, the crises of our age, like those of any age, are cultural. And in the end, spiritual. They are resolved at places like this. They are resolved or not within the realm of good and evil. And this is something Americans have a tough time with. Because central to the American mythology is this idea of progress. We tend to think of evil as some vaguely defined failure on the part of men to organize properly human society, right? The thinking goes something like this. We need only to apply the right social systems and the right technologies, at which point we will at last eradicate all forms of human suffering and ensure prosperity for all. This is an American idea. The chief proponents of this fool's errand in the perfectibility of human society include such figures as guillotine enthusiast Robespierre, communist Karl Marx, eugenicist Margaret Sanger, and mass murderers Joseph Stalin and Mao Zedong. The superabundant schemes the meddlers of the world have inflicted on mankind in their effort to eradicate what they call evil are in reality denials of original sin. Evil is not something to be overcome by a political or a therapeutic solution. Evil is personal, it is supernatural. You don't have to take my word for it. St. Paul's final chapter of his letter to Ephesians settles the question. We are not contending against flesh and blood, but against the principalities, against the powers, against the world rulers of this present darkness, against the spiritual hosts of wickedness in the heavenly places. Nonetheless, Americans, including a lot of faithful Catholics, look for solutions to our nation's ills in the outcome of the ballot box, in the legislation of the Senate House, in the decisions of the Supreme Court. To be sure, these battles must be fought, and fought hard. Catholic Answers long ago distributed millions of copies of a voter's guide to show people that their votes should be informed by the teachings of the Church. But we also recognize that the legislative battles of our day are reflections of the profound and widening cultural and spiritual divide that threatens to destroy our nation, and that is within the cultural institutions that the battle for the soul of America must be waged. And this has not changed in the least since the last election. Chesterton once described education as the soul of a society passing from one generation to the next. Let's expand on this insight and say the soul of America lives or dies, it is passed along or not, depending on the health of the cultural institutions through which it is transmitted. So what are these institutions? You all know them. First among them is marriage, and then the family. The family is the natural institution without which there can be no civilization, the natural institution. Marriage pre-exists the church and all human society. Chesterton writes in The Everlasting Man, more holy than the gods of the city are the gods of the heart. Next is the church, because the incarnation is nothing less than that moment when God touches human history. The church is necessary to civilization. There's no going back. All things in human experience must be transformed in Christ. These include the next set of cultural institutions through which our society lives and breathes, in which it suffocates, as the case may be. I'm speaking of primary and secondary schools, colleges and universities, and seminaries. Because of the incarnation, there can be no complete education that is not Christian education. Last and very powerful of these cultural institutions through which the society lives are the institutions of art and architecture, music, even those of popular culture. Peter Conley, of course, over and over emphasizing beauty, right? The film and the recording studios, the publishing houses and the presses. Every song we hear, every film we see, every book or poem we read, if you're not reading poems, shame on you. If you're not memorizing poems, shame on you. Every image, painted or photographed upon which we gaze, and the buildings in which we live, work, and worship, all of these have the power to edify, to delight, to inspire, or to corrupt. So let me repeat. Our society lives through marriage and the family, the church, the schools, the universities, and through all these organs of high and popular culture. When these things, my friends, are in good health, Christian civilization can thrive. When they are weakened or corrupted or in chaos, we're malformed. And that malformation is the condition of our land and her people today. The solution, the only solution, is the flourishing of a vibrant Catholic culture. That's it. And we cannot bring forth such a culture through elections or legislation. So you'll say, how can we? And on that score, I bring you tidings of great joy. But first, I feel it pains to state, I'm not calling on Catholics to withdraw from the world of politics. Well, not too much anyway. Far from it. This country needs good Catholics voting and good Catholics running for office. And the Catechism is explicit in its injunction that citizens who enjoy representative government, which is an open question, I suppose, but for us, but nonetheless, not to shirk that responsibility of civic life. But what I'm asking you to understand, I know you all do, is that by the time a moral issue has made its way to the halls of Congress for a vote, or to the floor of the High Court for a decision, the cultural battle has already been lost. So let's look at this question of marriage. Long before the United States Supreme Court pretended, as it did a couple of years ago, 3 years ago, to have the capacity to define marriage, the marriage battle had been lost. It had been lost in the conversations that take place around the kitchen tables of American homes. It had been lost in the situation comedies that for decades have subtly, and today considerably less subtly, infected American homes with their jolly and affectionate promotion of disordered lifestyles. It had been lost in the stories that celebrate so-called alternate family forms, that fill the reading texts of America's primary schools. It had been lost in the articles promoting feminist independence that are the stock and trade of so-called women's magazines. It had been lost in the gender-bending syllabi in the English departments of American universities. Trust me, I was an English major. It had been lost in the acceptance of no-fault divorce, beginning in my state, California, over 4 decades ago, Ronald Reagan. It had been lost in the cultural revolution that gave us the illusion of fornication without consequence in the 60s. It had been lost a generation and a half before that with the one thing that made the sexual revolution possible, the hormonal contraceptive. In other words, there's so much rubble to be cleared away, many lies to be exposed, and then considerable rebuilding to do on the way to a restoration of an authentic Christian culture. It's much easier to destroy than to create. Michelangelo took 2 years to carve the Pietà. A vandal marred it with the stroke of a hammer in an instant. Christian civilization was thousands of years in the making. Restoration will take a lot of time. But here's the good news. We can all do a great deal toward the building of a Catholic culture in America by first building a Catholic culture in our homes. I will go further. This work is vastly more important than campaigning for your favorite candidates or getting out the vote. Society radiates from the family out, not from the government down. Step one, Catholics must first attend to their interior lives. Here's another line of Latin. This one from the ancient Romans. Nemo dat quod non habet. No one gives what he does not have. My friends, the only meaningful way to change the world is to restore the binding force that Christianity once exercised on the world. But we can be part of this effort only if we first allow Christ to transform our hearts. You can't help save the world if you do not see first every day to your own salvation. Our Lord is explicit on this point. Seek ye first the kingdom of God. Changing the culture requires changing our interior lives. Spiritual reading, reading of the life of Christ, prayer before the Blessed Sacrament. A man cannot do good without first putting his soul in order. Nemo dat quod non habet. We cannot share love of God if we do not ourselves possess it. And it is in the interior life that we will cultivate love of God. This point is especially critical, by the way, for my colleagues at Catholic Answers. Right? For the first-rate team here at St. Martin's. And for anyone involved in spiritual work. The venerable French abbot Dom Chautard, in the book that would become Pope St. Pius X's bedside book, Soul of the Apostolate, is clear that unless apostolic work is suffused with love of God, it will bear no fruit. This is why at Catholic Answers we do lauds in the morning and vespers in the evening, daily mass, divine mercy, corporately. Again, St. Paul is going to back me up. What does he say? Absent love, an insight capable of penetrating the deepest mysteries of the human heart, of human experience, is worthless. Absent love, heroic acts of almsgiving are nothing more than a blaring trumpet, a clanging cymbal. A man can be eloquent and energetic, clever beyond his peers, wise beyond his years, but these talents will not serve him in the least unless they are leavened by love of Jesus Christ. And St. Paul makes clear that love is not self-seeking. It is, in fact, the opposite. Love seeks the good of the other. That's what it is. This takes me to my next step. Marriage. Marriage is in a state of chaos today, not because of the ugly antics of a handful of deviants, but because of the wholesale retreat from marriage among Christians, Catholics included, who are delaying or abandoning marriage altogether. Here are some quick data. When Jack and I were married 27 years ago this May, most American households were married couple households. Most. More than half. That's not true today. So in the space of a generation and a half. Most American households today are not. When I was born 52 years ago, 3/4 of 24-year-olds in America were married. 75% of 24-year-olds were married. That figure today is 9%. By the way, in case you might be thinking that this data does not apply to Catholics, I'm sorry to disappoint you. In 1972, there were 8.6 marriages per 1,000 Catholics. Today that figure is 2.6. So today there are less than a third of the number of marriages among Catholics that there were in 1972. I'll be blunt, many of you already know this. The single life is not a vocation. In a very real sense, what we call the vocation to marry doesn't even really require discerning. It's the human inclination to marry. It's universal. It may be sacrificed for the vocation of the priesthood or religious life. In either case, man is not meant to live alone. We've all read that somewhere. And since the incarnation, man is meant to live in the context of a vow. Look, no one's ever ready to get married, or to have children for that matter. We have 4, and we're still not ready. There will never be enough money, enough higher education, enough job security, enough of a house, enough certainty that she's the one. All these objections boil down to something embarrassingly pusillanimous: a lack of faith. Christians are not called to be pusillanimous. They are called to be magnanimous. Magnanimity requires not only greatness of heart, but also the capacity to give the heart away. Monsignor Ronald Knox said the problem of our age is not one of broken hearts, but hardened hearts. My brother has added to this, that the hardened heart is the one not given away. Only in giving ourselves away are we fulfilled. Is there risk in this? Yes. Every day. Magnanimity requires risk. Marriage is a risk. And so is my next suggestion. Have another child. It is the most pro-life thing you can do. If you want to help create a Catholic culture, bring another Catholic into the world. Now, for those of you who have done these things, here is my next suggestion. Cultivate the life of the domestic church in your homes. Step 1, shut off the noise. We're going to retread some ground from last year. Unplug the television. Reduce the time you spend online. This requires serious effort. Intentional is the popular word right now. This will, so insist on tech-free times, tech-free spaces in your home, tech-free Wednesdays and Fridays. Limit the time you spend on email. Really, you can't get all your email answered in the 8 hours you have at work. When you're at home, as Dr. Cutterback has said much more eloquently than I, be present to your spouse and children. Very important. If you have people who work for you, set them free, and by extension their families, on evenings and weekends. No texting or calling their mobile phones. It's not simply the content of the online world that threatens us. It's the effect that the modern communication has on human relationships. We went over this last year, and our relationship on the divine. And as I said last year, I'll say it again, the church has been aware of this longer than we all thought. 3 decades ago, before the pace of electronic communication reached the frenzy of today, the Holy See's Congregation for Catholic Education expressed grave concern over the formation of young seminarians in this culture of accelerated and instantaneous communication, right? This document, Training of Future Priests Concerning the Instruments of Social Communication. In the past decades, the instruments of social communication have come to the point of exercising an enormous and profound influence on every aspect, sector, and relationship of human society, right? And they acknowledge, sure, the sins of the 6th and 9th commandment are part of this, but there's something deeper. Moral aspects of mass media require deeper consideration than merely sexual morality, right? A fundamental human cost of too much electronic, visual, and auditory stimuli. The need in seminarian formation to find remedies for past excess in the misuse of mass media. And so what did that document describe? Things that we can all be doing, right? Guided in the love, the student must be guided in the love and practice of reading, study, silence, meditation, encouraged in conversation, to use complete sentences, diction, right? The document prescribed as a corrective, right? Group conversation, correctness of language, logical argumentation. This is a correction to the passivity which we all experience in front of the mass media. You don't need to be a seminarian to take this to heart. Cultivate lively and thoughtful conversation in your home. You will have time once you shut off the screen, right? Fill it with books. If you need a reading list, you can consult John Senior's Restoration of Christian Culture. You'll find the great stories of the Western canon there that fire the hearts of the young and teach virtue in the process. This is especially important if your children are in American schools. Public and yes, parochial. The new emphasis of Common Core that Bill and Melinda Gates have inflicted on young American minds is built on a decided and deliberate shift from storytelling, which fires the imagination, from storytelling in the early grades to what they call informational texts, right? These soul-deadening readings are designed to create the technocrats of the new America. If you want to fight it, give your kids Homer and Virgil. And then give them the language of Virgil. Latin is the language of the West. Everyone knows Latin helps with math, and it trains us to think analytically. It does all these things. But Pope Emeritus Benedict XVI pointed out, if you want to be a citizen of the West, you need to have some Latin. In giving your children Homer and Virgil, you will be giving something else that is essential to a vibrant Catholic home. Poetry. Poetry is the language of the heart, and the action of the heart is love. If you want your children to engage the mysteries of human experience and of our faith, you need to give them poetry. Again, you don't have to take my word for it. The Church's most analytical mind, Thomas Aquinas, tells us that we turn to poetry when the thing under consideration does not find sufficient expression in rhetoric or prose. Get your children reading and writing poems. Cultivate a life of music in the home. Take down the fiddle and the guitar. Learn folk songs and sing them aloud in the company of others. On this score, America has a great tradition. If you exhaust those, turn to Ireland. As Chesterton observes of the Irish, the great Gaels of Ireland are the men that God made mad, for all their wars are merry and all their songs are sad. I've described many of your homes. If so, they are righteous. If you have had the good fortune to have grown up in a joyful Catholic home full of Irish drinking songs and Latin poems, then I have one more suggestion for you. It's aimed at anyone here who is still discerning what to do with his life. Dan and Patrick have answered this call. Be a teacher. Be a teacher. Be a teacher. Our Catholic schools badly need young men and women who love Jesus Christ and who want to pass their love and knowledge of our Lord on to the next generation. The question of education is one on which we could dwell to the wee hours, but remember this. In the Catholic school, as Leo XIII put it, every subject is suffused with Christian piety, right? You don't need to be the religion teacher. I knew a teacher in the Denver parochial school. She had a sign in her classroom. It said, "To Jesus through math." All of these suggestions I've given will not satisfy anyone seeking quick results. And this is tough for Americans, where anything we want can be had with the swipe of a credit card. So we have to take the long view. But the long view is God's view. And when we abandon ourselves to His providence, His grace works wonders. Here's a story for any of us who look at the seemingly impossible task of transforming the culture in Christ. It comes from the life of St. Francis de Sales. In the 16th century, the Chablais was a province in the Duchy of Savoy. Placed by God at the bloody crossroads of France, Italy, and Switzerland, the province was the battleground in the wars spawned by the heresies of that most unpleasant of religious rebels, or as St. Francis called him, a stinker in an unguarded moment, John Calvin. The iconoclasts of Geneva rolled through the pastures of the Chablais, leaving behind political turmoil, hundreds of desecrated churches, and a mere remnant of terrified and persecuted Catholics, maybe 100 out of 25,000. Holding out hope for a return of the Roman liturgy, the sacraments of the church, and the joy of Catholic life. The man who restored the faith to the Chablais was Francis de Sales. 2 years into his priesthood, and armed with a Bible and a couple of texts of Bellarmine, and joined only by his cousin, a man named Canon Louis de Sales, Francis ventured north. Francis saved the fraternity of his cousin, found himself altogether abandoned in his effort. And most painful was the resistance of his own father, who made every effort to discourage his son and would not give him the least sum of money to support his mission. Francis says to his father, "Father, if I did not desire the responsibility, why should I put on the cassock?" On the morning of his departure for the Chablais, 14 September, exaltation of the Holy Cross, Francis's father would not even bid his son farewell. We really get this sense of acting alone. Belloc says this of Thomas More. He acted alone. We all have to act alone. Francis established a beachhead at the edge of the Chablais with the Baron de Hermans, a nobleman loyal to Rome. Each day, Francis and Louis walked the 10 miles into the region's capital city, Thonon. There they preached the Catholic faith to those who would hear. At the end of the day, they walked home. To stay overnight in Thonon would have put their lives in danger. And Francis, over the next 4 years, would suffer assassination attempts, attacks by wolves, and the privations of winter. The saints' unshod feet left bloody footprints in the snow. More discouraging than the physical suffering was the apparent total failure of the mission. A year passed, and then another, and then another, and still Francis had a handful of converts to show for his efforts. In his correspondence, Francis described preaching Advent sermons to 4 or 5. A number that our internet-burdened age would judge inefficient, to say the least. Did Francis de Sales yield? Not for a moment. To the Catholic remnant, he brought the sacraments for which they had so long longed. He slid his tracts defending the Catholic faith under the doors of Thonon's citizens. And with the city's ranking Calvinists, clergy, he treated with abundant measures of insight, wit, patience, and his characteristic good humor. When Louis showed signs of losing hope, Francis smiled, and he assured him they had planted so much seed that the harvest would not be far off. In the 4th year, like ears of wheat, the converts came. At first by ones and twos, a laborer here, a prominent Calvinist theologian here, there. Before long, Francis's field flourished with thousands of souls brought back to Holy Mother Church. As he later described it, the vines were exhaling their perfume. The conversion of the Chablais is one of the great stories of Catholic apologetics. And it was not brought about by legislation or an election. Why did St. Francis succeed? because his apostolic work was driven by love of God. Following the words of our Lord to St. Peter in Luke chapter 5, St. Francis de Sales, after his own long night of catching no fish, put out into the deep. Duc in altum, right? On my brother's ordination card, Duc in altum. My friends, I'll close with this. However you decide to put out into the deep, do it with joy. All of you know that on October 7th, 1571, the galleys of the Holy League squared off in the Bay of Lepanto against the galleys of the Islamic East. Christendom was saved by the intercession of Our Lady, and we honor the event each year, celebrating her Holy Rosary. Maybe you don't know this detail. Holy League was commanded by the 24-year-old Don John of Austria. And as his flagship, Real, was about to collide with the Ottoman flagship, Sultana, Don John, who was famous throughout Christendom as a great dancer, broke into a galliard on the prow of his vessel. So imagine this 24-year-old Captain General, overcome with anticipation of the impending battle, leaping and landing by the bow cannons. And now imagine the cheers the sight of his manifest thrill must have sent throughout his soldiers. And imagine seconds later, Spanish infantry, the world's finest, boarding Sultana, steel flashing, and Don John leading the charge, receiving and brushing off a wound to the leg that just a few moments before had been dancing. What is this? It is putting out into the deep with joy. And we should expect nothing less from a Christian soldier squaring off against the forces of evil. Chesterton gives us in the Ballad of the White Horse, Alfred the Great, who has lost all of his kingdom. And he's reduced to this marshy island the size of a football field. But does he curl up into a ball? No. The men of the East may spell the stars and times and triumphs mark, but the men signed of the cross of Christ go gaily in the dark. From Alfred the Great, badly outnumbered by the Danes, to Christopher Columbus, reading aloud the last gospel every night at the bow of Santa Maria, a second-hand sea-tossed vessel that could fit in this room, right? No more than about 60 feet long. To Hernan Cortez, conquering the demon-worshipping Aztec kingdom with 500 Spanish soldiers. To Thomas More cracking jokes on his approach to the shambles. To Don John dancing with sword drawn about to give battle. Christians have always gone gaily into the dark. They have always put out into the deep with joy. It is this joy, my friends, that is our patrimony as Christians. It is the one word that best describes our faith. This joy is sanctified and made holy in the service of Christ, but like all the great things in Christendom, we find glimpses of it in ancient times as the world anticipated the Incarnation. One more story. Remember the Spartans defending the hot gates at Thermopylae. If you don't know this story, go home and get out your Herodotus. The Spartans are outnumbered 500 to 1 by the armies of Xerxes. As they prepare for battle, one Spartan declares that he has heard that the Persian army is so numerous that their arrows black out the sun. And what does the Spartan Dienekes say? Good, then we shall have our fight in the shade. That is joy. My friends, I do not think we will have our fight in the shade. I think we will have it in the black of night that threatens to consume our troubled age. But nil desperandum, one more Latin phrase, as the Romans say, despair not. St. Paul assures us that grace is most abundant when it is in greatest demand. All of us have access to the infinite graces of the sacraments of the one holy Catholic Apostolic Church, And we have something that I can assure you will see us through every possible challenge and trial, the maternal solicitude of the Blessed Virgin Mary. Remember, Our Lady is most merciful, but she is also the fierce fighter who crushes the head of the serpent and is prefigured in the Song of Songs, Who is she that cometh forth as the morning rising, fair as the moon, bright as the sun, terrible as an army set in array. To be sure, Hernan Cortez faced down and vanquished the forces of darkness on the North American continent. But it was through the intercession of Our Lady of Guadalupe that a Christian culture flourished on these shores, and through her intercession may it flourish